Welcome back to the channel. This episode is going to be all about getting the pieces cut out, laminated, and hopefully installed for both the keel and the stem. Thanks for joining. For those of you watching that might not be familiar with some of the boat building terminology, the obvious first question is, what is the stem? So what the stem is the framing that forms the bow of the boat. And in a boat that's constructed the way the bowler is constructed, the stem is divided into two pieces, an inner piece and an outer piece. And what we'll be working on today is the inner stem, which is going to be made up of 4 layers of this 3/4 inch Meranti plywood, epoxied and screwed together to form one big curved piece of wood 3 inches thick. So I've already gotten a start and cut out 2 of the 4 pieces for the stem, just so I could keep my thinking clear. And what we're going to do is trace around the pieces that I have, cut them out roughly with a jigsaw, and then use a router and a router bit to trim them up to final shape. Now that I've got the 2 blank pieces cut out, slightly oversized, all I do is I take my original template piece, lay it on top of one of the blanks, make sure that the blank is overhanging at all spots around the perimeter, and screw them together and zip them with the router. the last step to take with the stem before I stop and break for lunch is to get the pieces laminated together. So I've laid out one of the outside pieces on one of the benches and the other 3 pieces on another bench. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up both unthickened and thickened epoxy, and I'm going to coat each of the mating surfaces with unthickened epoxy, and then one of the mating surfaces with thickened epoxy, and just keep repeating that until the whole thing is stacked up. The last thing to say about this is that this bench is flat, and that's extremely important because once this is laminated and I put some clamps on it, I want to make sure that I'm not laminating together a banana. Well, I never made it back out into the shop yesterday to keep working like I had planned. Stopped for lunch and got sidetracked, and that's how it normally goes. Anyway, it's all for the best because I allowed the epoxy to set up nicely. And I've gone ahead and stripped the clamps off the stem, and I'm going to grab the camera off the tripod, show you guys a couple things that I've marked out in advance of gluing everything together that are going to wind up being really important. I wound up leaving a little bit of the squeeze out in between the plies in place yesterday because I wanted to let it set up and show you guys some nice close-up footage of what I think is an appropriate amount of squeeze out. This right here, what that tells me is that there is no reason to expect there to be any voids in between any of the plies, and this way I know I have a solid epoxy bond. And this is of no consequence to take off with either a belt sander or probably a heat gun and a scraper. Another thing I want to point out is that when I cut the first ply of the stem out originally, I made a few marks that are going to turn out to be really helpful when it comes time to put the stem onto the building jig. Right here I've marked where station 2 is going to wind up intersecting the stem. And if we pan on up here, this shows both station 1 and the water line. And this is 36 inches above the water line. So using my laser, I should be able to line this up and the other marks up really nicely when it comes time to mount the stem onto the building jig. All right, now that I've gotten the station molds and the waterline marks transferred to the stem, there's only one more thing to do here in the shop and the stem will be ready for mounting. So in the drawings, Doug Hyland calls for mechanical fasteners to tie all 4 plies of the plywood version of the stem together. He doesn't specify exactly what kind of fasteners, but what I'm going to go with is 2 3/4 inch number 10 silicone bronze screws. And as far as spacing, just scaling off the drawings, it looks like about 4.5 inches apart. So the last thing that he called for in the specifications is for the fasteners to be driven from opposing sides, which makes sense if you're trying to create a nice tight sandwich. I do want to point out though that while I thought about these fasteners prior to epoxying the plies together, I decided against trying to put the fasteners in when the epoxy was still wet. Especially since fasteners were supposed to go from both sides. I could see that really turning into quite a clown show quickly, trying to wrestle this whole thing around and maneuver it. I don't think it's going to cause me any problems though. It's plenty strong as it is, and really all the screws do is they access the strength that's inside of the wood fibers, and putting them in now or putting them in when the epoxy was wet isn't really going to make any difference. So I'm going to get this laid out, get the fasteners put in, and then we'll switch gears and start milling the stock up for the keel. To the surprise of absolutely nobody that knows me, I've been a little bit too ambitious with what I was hoping to get accomplished for this episode. So instead of making it out to the boat shed like I had hoped, we're going to wrap up this episode by milling the material for the keel and cutting the scarf joints and getting the pieces epoxied together and ready for another day. The keel for the bowler is made up of a sandwich of 3 layers, with the outside 2 layers being made up of 1/2 inch thick by 5 inch wide Douglas fir, and those pieces are going to be scarfed to full length. And the inner core is 1/2 inch by 5 inch wide marine plywood, and according to the designer's instructions, that doesn't actually have to be scarfed together, which makes sense when you consider most composite construction. It's really the inner and outer surfaces that are doing most of the structural work. So I'm going to take these 2x6 Douglas fir boards that I have and send them through the bandsaw and rip the stock I have in 1/2 inch ply to width, and we'll get it ready to sandwich up. So there it is, not much to it really. The small table saw I'm using as a stock holder. And I've set a block up here at the end of the bench, and that was lined up with the laser. And some clamps to keep the beveled pieces from pushing apart like wedges. One clamp and a 2x4 block to spread the load out across the joint. And that's pretty much it. Secured it down at this end on the bench. That's going to do it for this episode. Thanks for joining me. And in the next one, we're going to get these pieces actually put on the boat.